August 19th, 1942. Guadalcanal. Captain Charles Brush led 60 Marines out of the wire before dawn and turned east along the coast road. His orders were straightforward. A Japanese radio station had been reported near Taivu Point. Find it, destroy it, come back. What he found instead, moving through the heat of midday, was a Japanese patrol, about 35 men, no point man out front, no spacing between them, no formation at all. They were walking like men who had nowhere particular to be. Brush flanked them. The whole thing was over in less than an hour. 31 Japanese soldiers dead, 3 Marines killed. When Brush's men went through the bodies, they pulled out documents, maps mostly. Brush could not read Japanese. He didn't need to. The positions on those maps were American positions. Every one of them. He said later, the maps were so accurate they startled him. So, that was where things stood in August of 1942. The Japanese knew where the Marines were. The Marines knew roughly where the Japanese were. Both sides were moving through the same jungle, watching the same ridgelines, running patrols down the same dark trails. That was August. By October, something had changed. The Japanese were still in that jungle, still moving, still running patrols. But they had stopped getting the information they needed. Not because the jungle changed, not because the Marines built a wall. Because a man no one outside the 1st Marine Division had ever heard of spent a few weeks in September and into October building something that had never existed before in the history of the United States Marine Corps. His name was Colonel William J. Whaling. He was not a graduate of the Naval Academy. He was not from a military family. William Whaling was born on February 26, 1894, in St. Cloud, Minnesota, the son of Canadian immigrants. His father was not a soldier. There was nothing about his early life that pointed toward what he would eventually become. In May of 1917, he walked into a Marine Corps recruiting station and enlisted as a private. Not an officer candidate, not a commissioned gentleman. A private. He shipped to France with the 6th Marines, 2nd Division, and went into the trenches in the Verdun sector in March 1918. Then came Belleau Wood in June, 3 weeks of some of the worst fighting of the war, in a patch of French woodland that changed hands 19 times before it was over. Whaling was gassed there, not wounded by shrapnel or a bullet, gassed. He spent the next 2 months in a hospital. The commission came while he was recovering. 2nd Lieutenant, August 1918. When he was well enough to return to the regiment, the war still had 3 months left in it. He went into the Saint-Mihiel offensive in September, fighting near Thiaucourt, where he distinguished himself well enough that the Marine Corps gave him a Silver Star for it. He was 24 years old. He had been in uniform for less than 2 years. He had already been gassed at Belleau Wood, promoted on a hospital bed, and decorated in the field at Saint-Mihiel. The armistice came before he could add anything else to that record. After the war, the Marine Corps kept him. In 1924, they sent him to Paris, not for the peace negotiations, for the Olympics. Whaling had spent 7 years making himself one of the best pistol shooters in the United States military, which at that time meant one of the best in the world. The 1924 Summer Olympics included a rapid-fire pistol competition, 25 meters, targets that gave you seconds to acquire and fire. 55 competitors from 17 nations. Whaling finished 12th. His American teammate, Gunnery Sergeant Henry Bailey, won the gold. Both of them were United States Marines. The years between Paris and Guadalcanal were not quiet years. They were instructional. China, Nicaragua, Haiti. Small places with big jungles and no clear front lines, where the man who understood terrain survived and the man who didn't became a story, told to the next generation of officers. Whaling did not write about what he learned in those years. There was no paper trail of personal philosophy, no manual with his name on it. What he carried was simpler than that. He knew how a man moved through dense vegetation without announcing himself. He knew how to read a tree line the way other men read a page, not for what it showed, but for what it was hiding. He knew that the jungle was not an obstacle. It was a condition, and conditions could be used. In 1941, he was promoted to lieutenant colonel and assigned as executive officer of the 5th Marine Regiment, 1st Marine Division. On May 21, 1942, he was made a full colonel. On August 7, 1942, he went ashore on Guadalcanal. The 1st Marine Division in the summer of 1942 was not a division with a surplus of experienced jungle fighters. Most of these men had trained in the United States on ranges and parade grounds. Some had served in China or the Caribbean, but the majority had never spent a month in a tropical jungle with a determined enemy, trying to kill them from positions they could not see. The Japanese they were fighting had no such inexperience. Japan's army had been at war in China since 1937, 5 years. Its soldiers had been moving through difficult terrain against armed opponents for longer than most of the Marines on Guadalcanal had been in uniform. An Australian general, writing a formal assessment in September of 1942 about why his forces were struggling against Japanese troops in New Guinea, listed near the top of his findings a single sentence that said everything. Higher standard of training of enemy in jungle warfare. That was not a small gap to close. On September 25, 1942, Whaling was relieved of his position in the 5th Marines. The reasons were internal, having to do with the division's assessment of the regiment's command structure. Whaling was not sent home. Colonel Gerald Thomas, the divisional chief of staff, intervened and kept him on the island. Whaling had no assignment. He asked Thomas for one. What he proposed was not a combat unit in any conventional sense. He wanted volunteers, enough to form a working detachment, and permission to train them for something the Marine Corps had never formally done before. Close patrolling, not reconnaissance in the broad sense, something more specific. Moving into terrain the enemy believed he controlled, locating exactly what was there, and disappearing before anyone knew you had been. Thomas brought the proposal to General Vandegrift. Vandegrift said yes. The men Whaling chose were not selected for size or speed or scores on standard fitness evaluations. He wanted to know where a man grew up. He wanted to know if the man had spent time outdoors before the war. Not camping, not day hikes, but real time in terrain, hunting, trapping, work that required patience and stillness and the ability to read the small things that most people look at without seeing. Appalachia sent him men. The rural South sent him men. The Plain States sent him men. These were Americans who had grown up in a world where the difference between a deer that bolted and a deer that didn't was the direction of the wind 3 minutes before you raised your rifle. They did not need to be taught to be quiet. They needed to be taught to do what they already knew how to do in a jungle instead of a forest. Whaling set up school on Guadalcanal itself. There was no time and nowhere else to do it. He taught stalking, the specific discipline of moving toward a position without triggering the animal awareness that every human being carries in the back of his skull. He taught camouflage not as face paint and foliage, but as the deliberate removal of yourself from the picture a trained eye would scan. And he taught the one rule that everything else depended on. You do not fire from the same position twice. One shot. Then you move. You are somewhere else before the sound finishes traveling. The Japanese could track a muzzle flash. They could triangulate a report. Given enough time, they could fix a position and put fire on it. Whaling was not going to give them time. There was one more element that no planning document had anticipated. The Solomon Islands had been home to people for thousands of years before the Japanese or the Americans arrived. Those people knew this jungle the way Whaling's men knew their home counties, not from maps, but from a lifetime of moving through it. Martin Clemens, a British coast watcher who had been on Guadalcanal since before the Marines landed, had already built a network of local scouts. Vandegrift had been using them since August. Their intelligence had saved American positions more than once. Whaling folded them into his group. They did not just show his men the trails. They taught them how to listen to a jungle, what it sounded like when nothing was wrong, and what it sounded like when something was. That distinction, which takes years to develop, is not something you can put in a training manual. You can only learn it from someone who already knows it. By early October, the whaling group was ready. The Japanese west of the Matanikau River did not know it existed. That was about to matter. The Matanikau River runs roughly north to south before it empties into the sea on the northwest edge of the marine perimeter. In the first weeks of October 1942, the Japanese were west of that river. That was the line. East of the Matanikau, Marines. West of the Matanikau, a Japanese force that had been rebuilding since the failed attacks of September, absorbing new men, new ammunition, new artillery pieces that had come ashore through the Tokyo Express night runs. General Maruyama's infantry, General Nasu's 4th Infantry Regiment, fresh troops, not the exhausted remnants of Kawaguchi's brigade, men who had not yet lost. Vandegrift needed to know what was over there. Not a general estimate, not a guess based on radio intercepts and Coast Watcher reports. He needed eyes across that river. Accurate, current information about exactly where the Japanese were building and exactly how many of them there were. He sent Whaling. The Matanikau had one crossing that both sides knew about. A single log bridge, maybe 4 feet wide. The kind of thing that took one man at a time and put him fully exposed for every step of the crossing. The Japanese had a guard post on the western bank. Anyone trying to use that bridge was going to announce himself before he got halfway across. That was the obvious crossing. Whaling was not interested in the obvious crossing. On the morning of October 7th, the Solomon Islands scouts moved ahead of the main group, working upstream along the eastern bank. They were not reading terrain from a map. They were reading it the way they had read it their entire lives, by what the water sounded like, by the way the undergrowth thinned or thickened, by marks on the bank that a man trained in a different part of the world would have walked past without noticing. 200 yards upstream from the log bridge, they found what they were looking for: a crossing point. Narrow, shallow enough to wade, and unguarded. The Japanese were watching the bridge. They were not watching everything else. Whaling moved his men across before the guard post on the bridge knew they were gone. They flanked west and south, moving through terrain the Japanese garrison believed it controlled. The whaling group did not announce itself. It did not fix a position and open fire. It moved, and it kept moving, placing men where they needed to be, pulling the net tighter with every hour. By the morning of October 8th, Whaling's force had linked up with the 5th Marines pushing from the south. The Japanese units west of the Matanikau, elements of the 4th Infantry Regiment, approximately 750 men, were enclosed on 3 sides. The river was at their backs. The jungle they had trusted to protect them had produced an enemy from inside it. It was a closing. 750 Japanese soldiers were killed, not routed, not captured. Killed. The after-action numbers were precise enough that the Marine Corps counted them. Vandegrift's official report on the Matanikau operations described Whaling's contribution to the reconnaissance and movement as, in his exact words, immeasurable. That word, immeasurable, appeared later in the formal commendation attached to Whaling's award citation, entered into the Bureau of Naval Personnel records. It was not a decoration given for a specific moment of bravery. It was given for something harder to quantify and harder to teach: the ability to move a force through terrain the enemy owned and deliver it to exactly the right place at exactly the right time, without the enemy knowing it had happened until the trap was already closed. There is a photograph that still exists from this period. Colonel Whaling in the lower left of the frame, looking down at a map spread on the ground, other officers gathered around him. Guadalcanal, 1942. He does not look like the popular image of a combat officer. He is not standing at a command post gesturing at a radio. He is on the ground, in the jungle, reading a map the same way he had been reading terrain since France. That photograph was taken before Matanikau. After Matanikau, the Japanese commanders west of the river had to explain to their superiors in Rabaul what had happened to 750 men. The Japanese response to contact was trained and disciplined. Identify the source, suppress it, flank it, destroy it. This is how armies operate. This is how they are taught. When fire comes from a fixed position, there is a sequence of actions that neutralizes it. Every trained soldier in the Pacific in 1942, American or Japanese, had that sequence in his muscle memory. But you cannot flank a position that is already empty. Japanese patrols sent to locate the source of fire found nothing. Not disturbed vegetation, not brass casings in an obvious cluster, not the compressed earth of a shooter's prone position, held for hours. The scouts of the Whaling Group had been taught by men who had spent their lives leaving no evidence of their passing. They had been taught by the Solomon Islanders, who had been moving through this specific jungle for generations. By the second week of October, Japanese officers west of the Matanikau were filing reports that described a problem they did not have language for. Patrols were making contact and losing track of where the contact came from. Snipers were engaging outposts and vanishing. Positions identified by sound could not be confirmed by any subsequent search. The men they were looking for were Americans from Kentucky and Georgia and the Carolina Mountains and the flat grasslands of the Plains states, men who had grown up with rifles before the Marine Corps ever touched them, and who had been trained in a few weeks of jungle schooling by a colonel who had spent his entire career accumulating knowledge that could not be put in a manual. They were not ghosts. They were just men who understood that the jungle does not hide you. You have to disappear into it. And once you know how, the man looking for you will spend hours searching the place you used to be. There is a September 6th intelligence report on file from the Guadalcanal campaign, signed by Colonel Clifton Cates, commander of the 1st Marines. It describes Japanese officers observed during patrols. All of them, Cates noted, were carrying swords and automatic pistols. That was September. They were still wearing rank, still carrying the visible marks of command, the sword that told every man in the formation who gave the orders, the posture that said the same thing without a word. By October, after Matanikau, they had stopped, not because anyone told them to, because enough of them had gone down in the wrong moment, in the wrong clearing, at a distance that shouldn't have been lethal, that the men who were still alive had drawn the only logical conclusion available. Someone was choosing them specifically. Whaling had built this into the training from the beginning, not as a rule written in a manual, as an understanding passed from one man to the next during the weeks of instruction in September and into October. The logic was simple enough that it didn't require much explanation. An army without soldiers is still an army. It still has weapons, ammunition, defensive positions, the ability to move and fire. An army without officers is something else. It is a body without a nervous system, capable of individual action, capable of reflexes, but no longer capable of coordinated response. It cannot adapt. It cannot redirect. It can only do what it was doing when the orders stopped coming. Whaling's men were not told to count kills. They were told to think about what a single shot, placed correctly, could do to a formation's ability to function. The answer, in a jungle where visibility was under 20 feet and reaction time was everything, was considerable. The Japanese officers who survived October on Guadalcanal learned to move differently. They removed their rank insignia before leaving the perimeter. They dressed like their enlisted men. They did not stand at the front of formations, did not gesture at terrain features with their arms extended, did not do any of the things that an officer does naturally and automatically when he is directing men in the field. It didn't fully work. Because rank insignia was never the tell was behavior. The tell was the slight pause that went through a column when a specific man stopped moving. The tell was the way a dozen heads turned toward one person when an unexpected sound came out of the tree line. The tell was the space that formed naturally around a man whose loss would matter most. Whaling's men had been taught to watch for all of it. Lieutenant William White, the intelligence officer attached to the 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines, Princeton class of 1939, on Guadalcanal since the first day, wrote about what patrolling felt like in practice during that period. He was not a man given to dramatizing. He was an intelligence officer. His job was to observe accurately, report precisely, and let the facts carry their own weight. He described moving through Point Cruz with his scouts. They heard a sound that someone mistook for a friendly signal. A whistle. It wasn't a whistle. He wrote, "Those were bullets, and some of them must have killed my friend Ramrod." White survived Guadalcanal. Ramrod did not. This was not a clean operation with clear lines between hunter and hunted. The whaling group operated inside a jungle where the Japanese had been for months, knew every trail, and were actively trying to do to the Marines exactly what the Marines were trying to do to them. Men died on both sides of that equation. The difference between them was not courage. Both sides had courage in quantities that are difficult to comprehend from a distance of 80 years. The difference was what happened in the seconds after contact. A Japanese patrol that made contact could report a position. By the time anything could be done with that information, the position was empty. A whaling group patrol that made contact was already somewhere else before the report was written. After the war, American translation teams worked through the diaries recovered from Japanese dead on the Pacific Islands. Not the dispatches of generals, not the operational orders of field commanders. The personal notebooks carried by ordinary soldiers, privates, corporals, junior officers, the people who write not to inform anyone else, but to make sense of what they are living through. The diaries from Guadalcanal had a quality that researchers noted was distinct from those recovered at other campaigns. Lieutenant Genjiro Inui of the 8th Independent Anti-Tank Gun Company had come ashore on August 30th, 1942. He kept a diary throughout the campaign and published his account after the war under the title My Guadalcanal. He was a trained officer. He had served before Guadalcanal. He had experienced combat before Guadalcanal. He wrote that his unit moved along the beach rather than through the jungle, not because the beach was safer. American destroyers ran the coast regularly. Naval gunfire was a real threat on any exposed shoreline. A man on a beach under shell fire has no cover. A man in the jungle, in theory, has all the cover in the world. He moved along the beach because in the jungle, he wrote, you could not tell what direction anything was coming from. He wrote it as a practical observation, not an admission of fear, not a complaint, a statement of operational fact, the way a man describes the properties of terrain he has learned to work around. He made a calculation: open ground and naval gunfire on one side, jungle, and something he had no name for on the other. And he chose the side with the shells. He had been on the island for weeks before he wrote it. Whatever he had seen or heard or lost in those weeks, He did not elaborate. He didn't need to. Researcher Aaron William Moore examined the vocabulary patterns in Japanese wartime diaries across multiple Pacific campaigns. In the Guadalcanal diaries, he found one word appearing with unusual frequency in entries from October onward: kakugo. In Japanese military culture, kakugo carries a specific weight. It means readiness, but not the readiness of a man preparing to do something he has trained for. It is the readiness of a man who has accepted that the outcome is no longer in his control. It appears in accounts of men preparing for banzai charges, for suicide missions, for final stands with no reinforcement coming. On Guadalcanal, in October 1942, kakugo was appearing in diary entries written before men left the perimeter during daylight. Not before an attack, before a patrol, before walking into the jungle in the afternoon. These men were preparing themselves in the same way they would prepare for a final charge, for the possibility that they would not come back from an ordinary patrol. Not because they were going into a known battle, but because the jungle itself had become the thing that could not be predicted. Something inside it fired and moved and left nothing behind. Something inside it selected specific men for specific reasons. Something inside it could not be found, could not be fixed, could not be countered by the 5 years of jungle warfare experience that these soldiers carried. They wrote kakugo and walked out anyway. That is not a small thing. On December 9th, 1942, the 1st Marine Division was relieved on Guadalcanal. They went to Australia. Nearly 3,000 casualties in 4 months. Malaria had put more men out of action than bullets had. The men who came off that island were thin in ways that photographs from that period make plain. Hollowed out by heat and disease, and months of fighting in terrain that never let them rest. They rested. They reorganized. In February 1943, the 1st Marine Division stood up the first formal scout sniper platoons in the history of the United States Marine Corps. The man who designed the training program was 1st Lieutenant Holly White, the same intelligence officer who had been on Guadalcanal since August 7th, who had walked the trails around Point Cruz, who had lost Ramrod to a bullet someone thought was a signal. He had spent 4 months watching what worked and what didn't. He had seen Whaling's methods produce results that the standard playbook couldn't explain. He knew exactly what had worked. He wrote it down this time. Those platoons went to Tarawa, to Saipan, to Peleliu, to Iwo Jima, to Okinawa. Every island the Marine Corps fought for in the remaining 3 years of the Pacific War. They fought with men trained in the doctrine first practiced in the jungle west of the Matanikau in October 1942. The Japanese total on Guadalcanal, when the numbers were finally compiled, more than 24,000 dead, roughly 7,000 in direct combat. The remainder from starvation and disease after the supply lines that ran through the jungle at night collapsed under the weight of an enemy that owned the daylight hours in terrain the Japanese had believed, with good reason, was theirs. In August 1942, before the Whaling Group existed, before Matanikau, before any of it, General Vandegrift wrote a letter to the Commandant of the Marine Corps, Thomas Holcomb. He was writing about the Marines who had fought at the Ilu River, the ones who had stopped Ichiki. He wrote, "These youngsters, once they get started, are the most vicious fighters I have ever seen." He meant it as praise. He had watched them fight. What he did not know, on the day he wrote that letter, was that a colonel with no current assignment was sitting somewhere on that same island, thinking about volunteers and a jungle that most men were still treating as an obstacle. Vandegrift's Marines were vicious. What Whaling made them was something the Japanese had no category for. Not louder, not faster, not more aggressive, quieter, present without appearing, gone before anyone could say where they had been. The Japanese spent 4 months on Guadalcanal trying to find them in that jungle. They never did.
August 1967, Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. An 86-year-old man died quietly. No state funeral, no statement from the White House. The New York Times ran a 4-paragraph obituary on an inside page. 20 years earlier, this man had commanded 225,000 American troops across the Philippines. He had defeated Yamashita Tomoyuki, the general who conquered Singapore in 70 days, the man Tokyo considered unbeatable. When the war was over and MacArthur needed one general to lead the invasion of Japan itself, he had 14 proven commanders to choose from. He chose this man, and when he died, America had no idea who he was. Only one person left behind words that came close to doing him justice. That person wrote, "History has not given him due credit for his greatness." The man who wrote that was Douglas MacArthur. The only general who truly understood how great Kruger was the only man in the world who could have told everyone. And he never did, not once, in 20 years. This is the story of Walter Kruger, the man his enemies never knew by name, and neither did his own country. Before we go any further, if you've ever heard the name Walter Kruger before today, drop a comment down below. I want to know how many of you already know who this man was. 1943. Walter Kruger was 62 years old. He was sitting in San Antonio, Texas. His Third Army had just finished a massive series of war games out in Louisiana. Hundreds of thousands of troops, tanks, artillery, the whole picture. He'd run it well. Younger generals had already shipped out to the fighting fronts. Kruger understood what that meant. At 62, he figured his war was going to be fought right here at home. Train the men, prepare them for someone else to use, wait it out. Then the cable from MacArthur arrived. Not an invitation, an order. MacArthur needed a ground commander in the Southwest Pacific. He'd gone through the list. He picked Kruger. The official record doesn't spell out exactly why, but the men who worked closest to MacArthur understood it plainly enough. Kruger was the one man MacArthur was certain would never compete with him for the spotlight. Kruger didn't ask to go. He didn't lobby for the assignment. He accepted the orders and started packing. On February 7, 1943, he stepped off the plane in Australia. The War Department wouldn't release his full Third Army staff to go with him. Kruger took command of the Sixth Army with less than half the standard headquarters strength. No complete communications set up, no proper office. His staff was patched together from officers he'd brought along and men pulled in from other units, many of whom had never worked a single day together. A staff officer named Mueller, a man who'd served under several generals before this, wrote afterward that this was the most professional headquarters he'd ever seen. And Kruger had built it, not with speeches, but by sitting down with his people every morning and going through the reports line by line. MacArthur gave the force a cover name, Alamo Force. It was the Sixth Army in disguise, reporting directly to MacArthur's headquarters, bypassing the normal chain of command. The official reason had to do with command structure. The real reason was that MacArthur didn't want Kruger subordinate to Australian General Thomas Blamey, who was nominally the Allied Land Forces commander in the region. MacArthur didn't like Blamey, didn't trust him, and wasn't about to answer to him. American reporters started asking questions. Who exactly was commanding Allied ground forces in the Southwest Pacific? The answer they got: Alamo Force. No general's name, no photograph, no press conference. The reporters started calling him the Mystery Man, because nobody gave them anything else to call him. Kruger didn't protest. He didn't call any newsroom. He didn't ask for a correction. He was reading terrain reports on New Guinea. He'd been born in Flatau, Prussia, in 1881, the son of a Prussian army officer. His family brought him to America when he was 8 years old. At 17, he enlisted as a private in the Spanish-American War. No West Point, no family connections. Nobody in Washington knew his name. He'd climbed every rank over 45 years. The hard way, the only way he knew, that was the man sitting in a tent outside Brisbane in February 1943, studying maps of New Guinea. Yamashita Tomoyuki, at that moment, was in Singapore. MacArthur had a way of working with Kruger. He'd call Kruger in, unroll a map, put his finger on a point along the New Guinea coastline and say, "I want troops there by this date." Then he'd leave the room. Everything after that was Kruger's problem. No Navy ready to move, no air cover with enough range, no accurate terrain maps, no reliable ground intelligence. Kruger would sit down with his staff and work through it piece by piece. How many landing craft they'd need, how long the supply lines would stretch, which beaches could take tanks, where to set up the field hospitals if the casualties ran higher than expected. MacArthur wanted fast. Kruger wanted right. The first operation came in June of 43, Kirawina and Woodlark Islands. No Japanese garrison, but Kruger ran the landing as though it were a full combat assault. His reasoning was simple. He wanted to test the procedures before he needed them somewhere men were dying. Kruger used it like a dress rehearsal. December 43. New Britain. Japanese resistance this time. Kruger adjusted his tactics in the middle of the fight without waiting for permission from above. April 44. Hollandia. MacArthur wanted to leapfrog the entire Japanese line, skip past Wewak, and land directly at Hollandia, 400 miles further west than where the front stood. 51,000 troops, 217 ships. The Japanese never saw it coming. Hollandia fell in 5 days. After Hollandia, MacArthur, Kruger, and General Eichelberger went aboard the USS Nashville. MacArthur ordered ice cream sodas. He said they ought to push the pace even harder. Kruger drank his soda and didn't say anything. He was already thinking about Biak. May 44. Biak Island. MacArthur needed the airfields there to support the next operation up the line. He wanted it wrapped up in a matter of days. Kruger assigned General Fuller the job with 2 regimental combat teams, a number both men calculated was enough. They were wrong. The Japanese on Biak hadn't set up along the beaches the way they had everywhere else. They had tunneled deep into the coral limestone, building an underground defense network that didn't show up on any map. Every time American troops took a hill, Japanese soldiers would appear behind them from tunnel exits nobody knew were there. 2 weeks passed, then 3. MacArthur needed those airfields. He was sending Kruger cables every single day. Kruger relieved Fuller and brought in Eichelberger. It didn't speed things up much, because the terrain and the Japanese defenses hadn't changed just because a different general was in charge. Biak dragged on for nearly 3 months. MacArthur was furious. The press didn't cover Biak the way they'd covered Hollandia. Kruger's name didn't appear in either story. Nomfur, Sansapor, Morotai. Every island was a different problem. Different terrain, different weather, different Japanese dispositions. No formula worked twice. Kruger solved each one without complaint, without asking for more time. But there was one thing he absolutely would not bend on. He would not order an attack until his ground intelligence was solid. That was the point he and MacArthur fought over for 2 straight years. Not with raised voices, but with Kruger refusing to sign attack orders when the picture wasn't clear, and MacArthur sending cables every week demanding he move. It's worth understanding exactly why Kruger felt so strongly about this. Earlier in the war, American forces had launched a full-scale invasion of Kiska Island in the Aleutians, a massive operation, thousands of men, weeks of preparation, only to discover the Japanese had evacuated the island days earlier. Nobody had bothered to verify. Kruger had watched that happen and decided it would never happen to him. That was why he built the Alamo Scouts. November 43, Kruger established the Alamo Scouts, his own special reconnaissance unit, men trained to infiltrate behind Japanese lines, gather real intelligence, and get back out. He created them after a Navy reconnaissance unit had come back 11 days late from a mission, then been held another 4 days for debriefing, so that by the time the information reached Kruger's desk, it was already useless. He wasn't going to run a war on stale intelligence. By the fall of 1944, the Sixth Army had completed 20 consecutive successful amphibious landings across more than 2,000 miles of coastline. Not one had failed. American papers covered every battle. MacArthur appeared in every story. Kruger's name appeared in almost none of them. He was busy planning the Philippines. And in Manila, Yamashita Tomoyuki had just received his orders from Tokyo. October 5, 1944. Manila. Yamashita Tomoyuki stepped off the plane. 15 days before the American landings on Leyte. He wasn't welcomed as a savior. He was sent because his predecessor, General Kuroda Shigeru, had spent the past 2 years neglecting the Philippines' defenses while spending his time at golf clubs and Manila dinner parties as the war closed in around him. The generals in Tokyo knew the Philippines were probably lost. They needed a man capable enough to lose slowly. Yamashita looked at the maps and understood the situation in a matter of days. He had 225,000 troops on paper, but they were scattered across dozens of islands. The Navy had lost most of its experienced carrier pilots at the Philippine Sea in June. The Air Force had lost most of its experienced pilots in the same battle. Supply lines from Japan were being cut week by week by American submarines. Japanese intelligence had been tracking American forces in the Southwest Pacific for some time. Yamashita knew MacArthur's name. He knew Kenny, the air commander. He knew Kincaid, the admiral running the 7th Fleet. His staff had detailed files on all of them, but the name of the general commanding the American ground forces, the troops who would actually be stepping onto Philippine soil, didn't appear in any file. Japanese intelligence had only this: Alamo Force, no general's name. Yamashita reached his conclusions within a few days. Leyte could not be held. The Philippines could not be held. The only thing he could do was make the Americans pay so dearly in time and men that Japan might eventually reach a negotiated settlement. His recommendation to his superiors: abandon Leyte, concentrate everything on Luzon, fight a defensive war in the mountains. Tokyo said no. Field Marshal Terauchi, commander of Southern Army, issued the order: defend Leyte, send in reinforcements, counterattack. Yamashita accepted the order. He disagreed with it completely, but he carried it out. On October 20th, Kruger's forces landed on Leyte with 175,000 men. MacArthur waded ashore and spoke into a microphone. MacArthur's headquarters sent out a communiqué that went to every newsroom in America within the hour. Yamashita read the intelligence reports on the landings. He asked again, "What is the name of the American ground commander?" The answer was the same as before: Alamo Force. In the weeks that followed, Tokyo kept pouring troops into Leyte over Yamashita's objections. In November, a convoy carrying 11,000 Japanese reinforcements entered Ormoc Bay. American air power intercepted it. 6 transports were sunk. 4 destroyers were set ablaze. Most of those 11,000 men never made it to shore. Yamashita read that report too. He had told them this would happen. He quietly stopped sending reinforcements to Leyte and began preparing for Luzon, not because Tokyo had given him permission, but because he knew that continuing to push men into Leyte was the same as pushing them off a cliff. In December, MacArthur issued a communiqué. The Leyte campaign was essentially over. An estimated 5,000 Japanese remained on the island. The real number, the Eighth Army, subsequently killed another 27,000 Japanese on Leyte before that campaign actually ended in May 1945. Yamashita was no longer on Leyte. He was on Luzon, preparing for the battle he'd known was coming since the day he arrived. And he still didn't know the name of the man commanding American forces. December 1944. MacArthur's headquarters on Leyte. MacArthur called Eichelberger in for a private meeting. No record was kept. He told Eichelberger that Kruger was moving too slowly, that the Sixth Army should have finished Leyte weeks ago, that Kruger was an overage officer who no longer had the energy to drive his men the way the situation demanded, and that he was thinking about whether he needed to make a change. Eichelberger wrote all of this down in a letter to his wife. What MacArthur didn't mention in that conversation: Kruger was fighting at Breakneck Ridge, a mountain terrain feature whose name told you everything you needed to know. The Japanese had dug into natural defensive positions that no force in the world could take quickly without accepting catastrophic casualties. Kruger had deliberately slowed his advance because he'd read the intelligence and believed Yamashita was setting a trap at Karigara Bay, waiting for Kruger to sprint forward and walk straight into it. After the war, captured Japanese documents confirmed it. Yamashita had been planning to land additional troops at Karigara Bay, exactly where Kruger had suspected. The operation was called off only because an American convoy happened to move through the area at the right moment. If Kruger had pushed the pace the way MacArthur demanded, his lead elements would have walked directly into that. MacArthur never actually relieved Kruger. Not because he changed his mind, but because Leyte wound down before he made a decision. And when Leyte was finished, MacArthur needed Kruger for Luzon. The final tally for the Leyte campaign: Japan lost 56,665 men. The Sixth Army lost 3,049. 19 Japanese dead for every one American. MacArthur included those numbers in his December 25th communiqué. Kruger's name did not appear in it. January 9th, 1945, Lingayen Gulf, Luzon. Kruger put 70,000 men ashore on the first day. The objective was Manila. Yamashita hadn't placed his forces at the beaches. He had withdrawn into 3 fortified mountain strongholds across Luzon, north, west, and east of the Manila Plain. 225,000 men, not positioned to win, positioned to make this last as long as possible. This was the strategy Yamashita had wanted from the beginning, before Tokyo had forced him to waste his army at Leyte. Now, finally, he was fighting his own way. Kruger understood that. Before a single American boot touched the beach at Lingayen, the Alamo scouts had already been there. Teams of 2 to 6 men, coming in by rubber boat, moving through Filipino villages, linking up with guerrilla networks. They brought back reports on Japanese defensive positions, troop strength, patrol routes. Kruger read every one of those reports himself. There's a detail about the Alamo scouts that almost nobody knows. When they weren't on reconnaissance, they served as Kruger's personal security detail, and they carried a specific standing order from Kruger himself. If the general was in danger of being taken alive, shoot him. Kruger knew too much. He was read into Ultra, the program that had broken Japanese codes, intelligence so sensitive the Americans could not allow any hint of it to fall into enemy hands under any circumstances. He was not permitted to be captured. He'd told the scouts that directly, That was the man commanding the Luzon campaign. Some Alamo scout missions on Luzon had a different kind of objective, locating senior Japanese officers. On that list was the name Yamashita Tomoyuki. Two men were looking for each other. One knew his enemy's name, the other did not. On January 27th, Kruger received an intelligence report from his 6th Army G2. More than 500 American prisoners were being held at a camp near Cabanatuan, 30 miles behind Japanese lines. The report also indicated that a Japanese division was withdrawing through that area. And if they passed through the camp before American forces arrived, those prisoners could be massacred. Kruger gave the order the same day. 121 Rangers, 2 teams of Alamo Scouts, and more than 200 Filipino guerrillas set out on the night of January 29th. They walked 30 miles through Japanese-controlled territory in darkness, leaving no trace, firing no shots until they reached the objective. The night of January 30th, a P-61 Black Widow night fighter made low passes over the camp to draw the guards' attention. At that moment, the Rangers and Scouts hit from multiple directions simultaneously. 15 minutes, 511 prisoners freed, 225 Japanese soldiers killed, 2 Rangers lost. Those prisoners had been in Japanese captivity for nearly 3 years, since the Bataan Death March. Many of them could not walk. Rangers and Filipino guerrillas loaded them onto carabao carts and moved them through the night toward American lines. Not one man was left behind. This was the most celebrated special operations raid of the entire Pacific War. Kruger ordered it. His Rangers and Scouts executed it. Kruger's name appeared in almost none of the press coverage. MacArthur kept pushing for speed toward Manila. Kruger kept checking the casualty reports every morning. He knew Yamashita was waiting for him to move too fast, stretch too thin, expose a flank. On February 3rd, the 6th Army broke through into Manila from the north. Yamashita had ordered Manila abandoned. He couldn't hold a city of 1 million people without food, without maneuvering room, without logistics. But the Japanese Navy units in the city refused to obey. They stayed. The Battle of Manila lasted a month and destroyed most of the old city. Yamashita retreated into the mountains of northern Luzon with what remained of his army. He didn't have enough strength to attack any more. But he had enough terrain to hold. Kruger went after him, position by position, steady, methodical, the way Kruger always fought. MacArthur issued a communiqué on July 5th. The Philippines had been liberated. Yamashita was still fighting in those mountains with 50,000 men. September 3rd, 1945, Baguio City, Philippines. In the drawing room of the American High Commissioner's residence at Camp John Hay, a long table had been set up. Allied officers stood in a line on one side. Yamashita Tomoyuki walked in, wearing his full uniform, and sat down across from them. MacArthur was not in the room. He was in Tokyo. The signing ceremony aboard the USS Missouri had taken place the day before, and MacArthur had stood at the center of that photograph. The man sitting directly across from Yamashita was General Jonathan Wainwright, the man who had surrendered the Philippines to the Japanese in 1942, who had spent more than 3 years in Japanese prison camps in Manchuria, who had walked out of captivity just weeks before, looking like a skeleton. Beside Wainwright was British General Arthur Percival, the man Yamashita himself had forced to surrender Singapore back in 1942. MacArthur had chosen these 2 men deliberately. The symbolism was the whole point. The men Yamashita had once humiliated were now receiving his sword. Kruger was not in that room. He was somewhere on Luzon, processing the surrender paperwork for 50,000 remaining Japanese troops. Administrative work, no photographers, No reporters. Yamashita signed the documents. His sword was placed on the table in front of the Allied officers. The cameras flashed. Wainwright's name was in every paper the next morning. MacArthur's name was on the front page. Kruger's name did not appear. The man who had commanded the entire Philippine campaign, from the Leyte landings in October 44 to the day Yamashita walked out of those mountains, was not mentioned in a single news report that day. On March 5, 1945, in the middle of the Luzon fighting, MacArthur had submitted Kruger's name for promotion to full general, 4 stars, the highest rank in the American Army at that time. Washington approved it. Kruger received the notification on an ordinary morning at his forward headquarters. No ceremony, no pinning of stars. He read the cable, set it down, and went back to the morning intelligence summary. No photograph was taken that day either. After the war, Kruger went home to San Antonio, Texas. He and Grace, the woman he'd married in 1904, who had waited out the entire Pacific War in the States, settled into a quiet life. He wrote a memoir. He called it From Down Under to Nippon. It covered every campaign from 43 through 45. He wrote it in the style of a military report, precise, factual, stripped of emotion. Not one line criticizing MacArthur, not one sentence asking for recognition. The book didn't sell well. He didn't give interviews, he didn't appear on television, he didn't show up at the big commemorations where other generals sat on stages and received standing ovations. In July 46, Kruger retired. His 4-star rank was made permanent under a standard Army provision, not through a formal promotion ceremony, but through an administrative clause in military law. That was how America officially recognized 2.5 years of fighting across the Pacific, a line of regulatory text in the Army's retirement statutes. 1955. Grace Kruger died of cancer. A friend who was present at the funeral wrote afterward that Kruger wept openly throughout the service. He told that friend he would be joining Grace soon. The friend thought he was speaking out of grief, but Kruger was telling the truth in his own way. Not that he would die soon, but that he no longer had a reason to push himself to keep going. He lived 12 more years. In those 12 years, he occasionally wrote letters to veterans of the 6th Army. He attended a memorial in the Philippines in 1960. In 63, he went to a tribute event for MacArthur in New York City. The man who had nearly fired him in the middle of a campaign, the man who had left his name out of hundreds of press communiques, the man who had stood at the microphone while Kruger sat reading intelligence reports. Kruger sat in that room, had a drink, and never said a word about any of it. August 20th, 1967. Walter Kruger died at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, 86 years old. The New York Times ran a 4-paragraph obituary on an inside page. No state funeral, no statement from the White House, no monument in Washington, only one person left behind, words that came close to doing him justice. Douglas MacArthur, the man who stood at the microphone while Kruger read the intelligence reports, who was photographed on the beach while Kruger planned the attack, who stood at the center of that photograph in Baguio while Kruger processed the surrender paperwork out on Luzon, wrote these words after Kruger was gone. History has not given him due credit for his greatness. That was true, and it was written by the one man who could have changed it for 20 years. And never did. If your father or grandfather served in the Pacific, write their name in the comments below. Let the other families find it. Let them know that their grandfather's fellow soldiers are still being remembered.
April 3rd, 1946, 4 o'clock in the morning. Los Baños, Laguna, 30 miles southeast of Manila. A Japanese general stands in the floodlights with his hands tied behind his back. He is 58 years old. His hair is gray. His face is calm. 12 American riflemen are looking at him. 4 years earlier, this same man had done something that no enemy commander had managed in the entire history of the Pacific War. He forced an American army to surrender. Not a patrol, not a garrison, an army. 75,000 American and Filipino soldiers laid down their arms because of him. The largest surrender of American-commanded forces in the history of the Pacific. Douglas MacArthur, the general who lost the Philippines, had fled on a torpedo boat in the dark and made a promise. I shall return. Now MacArthur had returned. He had won the Pacific. He had accepted Japan's surrender on the deck of the USS Missouri. And then he had turned his attention to the man standing in this field. The man who had beaten him. MacArthur chose the judges. MacArthur chose the prosecutors. MacArthur reviewed the sentence, and MacArthur signed the order that put this man in front of those 12 rifles. The question nobody asked at the time, and almost nobody asks now, is whether what happened in that courtroom was justice, or whether it was something else entirely. His name was Masaharu Homma, and to understand what he did and what was done to him, you have to go back to December of 1941, to the Philippines, and to the moment everything fell apart. He steps into the first PT boat. His wife Jean follows, holding their 4-year-old son Arthur by the hand. The little boy has no idea what is happening. The boats pull away from the dock and slip out into the dark water. Behind them, still on Bataan and Corregidor, 90,000 men. American soldiers from Texas, from Ohio, from New Mexico. Filipino soldiers fighting for their own homeland. Army nurses who had signed up to serve and found themselves in the middle of a siege. Pilots who had been without planes since December, when the Japanese bombed Clark Field and destroyed most of MacArthur's air power in the Philippines in a single afternoon. Sailors without ships, mechanics without equipment, doctors without medicine. 90,000 people, and not one of them is on those boats. The 4 PT boats run south through the night, 560 miles through waters the Japanese Navy controls. Mines below the surface. Enemy destroyers patrolling every major channel. The sea is rough. MacArthur, never a comfortable sailor, grips the rail and says nothing. At one point, the boats become separated in the darkness, each one alone, running blind, hoping the others are still out there somewhere. They make it to the island of Mindanao more than a day later. MacArthur steps onto the dock and turns to the young lieutenant who commanded the lead boat, a Navy officer named John Bulkley. He says, "You've taken me out of the jaws of death, and I won't forget it." He meant it. He never forgot. From Mindanao, MacArthur and his party boarded a B-17 Flying Fortress and flew south to Australia. On March 20th, 9 days after leaving Corregidor, he stepped off a train at a small railway station in the Australian countryside. A handful of reporters were waiting. MacArthur looked at them, and he said, "I came through, and I shall return." 3 words, I shall return. Those 3 words would be printed on leaflets and dropped over the Philippine jungle. They would be broadcast on radio across the Pacific. They would be carved into the memory of every Filipino who heard them. They were a promise. But here is the question that nobody asked that morning in Australia. The question that nobody asked, because the answer was too uncomfortable. What about the man on the other side? The Japanese general whose forces had pushed MacArthur's army back, mile by mile, from the beaches of Luzon, all the way to the tip of the Bataan Peninsula, until there was nowhere left to go. The general whose army had taken everything MacArthur had built in the Philippines and taken it apart, the man who had, in the plainest possible terms, driven Douglas MacArthur out of the Philippines. What happened to him? Stay with me, because the answer to that question is one of the most remarkable stories to come out of the entire Pacific War. And it begins, not in Japan, but on a peninsula about 30 miles west of Manila, where 90,000 men were about to face something that had no name yet. The Bataan Peninsula, 30 miles long, 15 miles wide, jungle-covered mountains running down the middle like a spine. On the map, it looks like a thumb pointing south into Manila Bay. In January of 1942, it became the last piece of the Philippines that American and Filipino forces still held, and the men who held it had nothing. When MacArthur ordered the retreat to Bataan in late December, the plan called for massive stockpiles of food and ammunition to be moved there in advance. It didn't happen. Tons of rice, enough to feed the garrison for months, sat in warehouses in central Luzon, left behind in the chaos of the retreat. Medical supplies, fuel, spare parts, left behind. By the time the last men crossed onto the peninsula and the defensive line was drawn, rations had already been cut in half, from the very first day. Now picture this. It is January 1942 on the Bataan Peninsula. You are an American soldier. You might be from New Mexico, the 200th Coast Artillery, one of the first American units to fire on Japanese aircraft after Pearl Harbor. You might be from Illinois, from California, from a small town in the South that you haven't seen in over a year. You are living in the jungle. The temperature during the day runs over 100 degrees. At night, the mosquitoes come, and with the mosquitoes, malaria. Historians estimate that over 70% of the men on Bataan contracted malaria during the siege. 70%. And there was almost no quinine left to treat it, so you fight it with whatever you have, which is mostly nothing. Dysentery sweeps through the ranks, then dengue fever, then beriberi, a disease caused by severe vitamin deficiency that makes your legs swell and your nerves stop working. By February, 10,000 men are lying in 2 open-air jungle hospitals, not tents. Open air. Cots set up under the trees because there are no buildings large enough and no supplies to build them. The doctors work around the clock with whatever they have. The nurses, Army nurses, American women who had volunteered to serve, work beside them. They are being shelled regularly. They keep working. The food gets worse. By March, the men are living on less than 1,000 calories a day. They are eating everything they can find. Carabao, the Philippine water buffalo, monkeys from the jungle, horses and mules from the cavalry units, which no longer have a use for them. One soldier later wrote that he hadn't thought about food so much in his entire life as he did on Bataan. He thought about it every waking hour. Meanwhile, no reinforcements come. The men on Bataan knew this. They had radios. They heard the news. They understood that Washington had made a decision. Europe first. The Pacific would have to wait. There was a verse that circulated on Bataan during those months. The men called themselves the battling bastards of Bataan. Their words, not mine. It went like this. No mama, no papa, no Uncle Sam, no aunts, no uncles, no cousins, no nieces, no pills, no planes, no artillery pieces, and nobody gives a damn. They knew, and they kept fighting anyway. 29 days, 45 days, 60 days. The Japanese throw assault after assault at the American and Filipino lines. They are repulsed. Again and again and again. The men on Bataan, starving, sick, outnumbered, hold the line for 99 days. 99 days. While every other American position in the Pacific is falling. While Guam falls. While Wake Island falls. While Singapore falls to a Japanese army, a fraction of the size of its British garrison. Bataan holds. Not because they have supplies. Not because reinforcements are coming. But because of the men standing in those jungle trenches. By early April, the math has become impossible. The Japanese launch a final massive assault on April 3rd. The American and Filipino lines, held together for 3 months by sheer will, begin to crack. Major General Edward King commands what's left of the Bataan garrison. MacArthur, now in Australia, has sent a direct order. No surrender. King looks at his men. A third of them are too sick to stand. The ones who can stand are hollow-eyed, 30 pounds underweight, running on nothing. There is no ammunition left for a counterattack. There is no food left for another week. There is no way out. On the morning of April 9th, 1942, King sends a message to his officers. He tells them what he has decided. Then he says something that every man who heard it would carry for the rest of his life. He says, "You men remember this. You did not surrender. You had no choice but to obey my order." He accepts every ounce of responsibility himself, and then he walks forward to meet the Japanese commander. 75,000 American and Filipino soldiers lay down their arms on the Bataan Peninsula on April 9th, 1942. The largest single surrender of American-commanded forces in the Pacific War. These men had fought for 99 days, half-starved, disease-ridden, abandoned by their supply chain, cut off from reinforcement. They had held longer than anyone had a right to expect. They had earned the right to be treated with dignity. What happened next had no dignity in it at all. April 9th, 1942, Mariveles, the southern tip of the Bataan Peninsula. The Japanese gather the prisoners together and point them north. Walk. That is the order. Walk north. Nobody tells them how far. Nobody tells them how long it will take. Nobody tells them what will happen if they stop. 75,000 men, American and Filipino, begin to walk. The temperature is over 100 degrees. It is April in the Philippines. The wet heat sits on you like a wool blanket. These men have just spent 99 days fighting a siege on half rations. Many of them are already sick. Many of them have open wounds. Many of them are so weak they have been leaning on a rifle just to stay upright in the trenches. Now they are being told to walk. North, 65 miles. In the first hour, the guards order the prisoners to lay out everything they are carrying. Wallets, rings, watches, photographs, everything. Anyone found holding Japanese currency, even a single coin, is assumed to have taken it from a dead Japanese soldier. The consequences are immediate. American soldier Kermit Lay later described those first minutes. He said the guards pulled groups of men into a rice paddy and went through everything they owned, one by one. Slapping, shouting. He laid out his New Testament on the ground in front of him. Nobody touched it. Then they start walking. The road north runs through flat farmland under open sky. No shade. The column moves in groups of 100 men. There is no water distributed along the route. The road passes streams and irrigation ditches. The men are not permitted to stop. One survivor, Lester Tenney, later recalled watching the man in front of him reach down toward a puddle of standing water at the side of the road. And what happened to him for doing it? Tenney kept walking. Day 1 becomes day 2. Day 2 becomes Day 3. Filipino civilians line the road in some places. They hold out food, sugar cane, pieces of fruit, water in whatever container they could find. Some of them get it through to the prisoners. Some of them are punished for trying. The men in the column who fall behind, fall behind. The column does not slow. The column does not stop. Men who cannot keep up are left where they fall. Day 5. The column reaches San Fernando. Here the men are loaded onto trains, steel boxcars, sealed. 100 men are packed into a space designed for freight. No windows, no ventilation. The cars sit in the Philippine sun while the train is assembled. Then they move north to the station at Capas. From Capas, the men walk the final 7 miles to Camp O'Donnell, a former Philippine Army training base, now a prison camp. 75,000 men began that road. 54,000 reached the camp. At Camp O'Donnell, the dying did not stop. It accelerated. The water supply was a single faucet for thousands of men. Men waited hours in line for a drink. Flies rose from the latrines and covered whatever food existed. Malaria, dysentery, beriberi. The diseases that had stalked them on Bataan followed them here. In the early weeks at Camp O'Donnell, men died at a rate of 400 a day. 400 a day. There were so many dead that the burial details could not keep up. Back home in the United States, families were waiting. Mothers, fathers, wives, children. The government had kept the details of what was happening in the Philippines under strict embargo. They didn't want the Japanese to retaliate further against the prisoners, so the families waited and didn't know. And it would not be until January of 1944, nearly 2 years later, that the Roosevelt administration finally released the details of what had happened on that road. The reaction across America was one of the deepest waves of grief and fury the country had felt since Pearl Harbor. The men who walked that road, and the men who did not survive it, gave it a name that has never been forgotten. The Bataan Death March, one of the worst war crimes committed against American soldiers in the history of this country. The Japanese general who commanded the forces responsible for that road, his name was Masaharu Homma, and 4 years later, Douglas MacArthur would remember that name. If this video is bringing back a piece of history that deserves to be remembered, if you had a father or a grandfather or an uncle who served in the Pacific, and this story means something to you, hit the like button right now. Not for me, for the men on that road. Now, you need to understand who Masaharu Homma was, not because he deserves sympathy, but because the men who sent him to the Philippines knew exactly what they were doing. This was not a random assignment. Homma was born in 1887 on a small island in the Sea of Japan. He graduated near the top of his class at the Imperial Japanese Army Academy. In a military culture that valued seniority, family connections, and rigid hierarchy, Homma advanced on talent alone. He could read terrain. He could read an enemy's position. He could move large numbers of men across difficult ground faster than anyone expected. But what made him different from every other senior Japanese general in 1941 was this. He had spent years living in the West. He had served as a military attaché in London. He had watched British officers train. He had studied how Western armies thought about logistics, about flanking movements, about the psychology of command. He understood the American and British military mind in a way that almost no Japanese general could claim. When Tokyo looked at the Philippines in late 1941, at the 60,000 American and Filipino troops defending those islands, there was one general they wanted for that assignment, Masaharu Homma. They gave him 43,000 men, and they gave him a deadline, 50 days. Take the Philippines in 50 days. Every day beyond that was a day the Americans had to reinforce their positions across the Pacific. Every day beyond that was a day lost. Homa understood the assignment. December 22, 1941. Japanese forces land at Lingayen Gulf on the northern coast of Luzon. It is 15 days after Pearl Harbor. The American and Filipino defenders do not have the strength to hold the beaches. They fall back. January 2, 1942. Manila falls. MacArthur pulls his forces onto the Bataan Peninsula and digs in. The siege begins. For the next 99 days, the men on Bataan hold. But by March, Hama's forces have been reinforced. Fresh troops, fresh ammunition, air support. On one side of the line, a Japanese army that has been resupplied and rested. On the other side, men who have been fighting for 3 months on starvation rations with no medicine and no relief coming. April 9th, 1942. Bataan falls, May 6th, 1942. Corregidor, the island fortress at the mouth of Manila Bay, the last American holdout in the Philippines, surrenders. The Philippines are gone. It took Hama not 50 days. It took him 5 months. The men on Bataan had cost him that time. Every single day of it. But the result was what Tokyo wanted. MacArthur was gone. The Philippines belonged to Japan. And somewhere in Australia, a general sat at his desk and didn't forget. 2.5 years pass. The war grinds on across the Pacific. Midway, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan. Island by island, the Americans push back north and west. MacArthur commands Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific from his headquarters in Australia, then New Guinea. He does not forget the Philippines. He does not forget the men he left there. For 2.5 years, he fights his way back, island by island, mile by mile, with one destination in mind. October 20th, 1944. American forces land on the island of Leyte in the central Philippines. MacArthur wades ashore through knee-deep water. A microphone has been set up on the beach. He leans in and says, "People of the Philippines, I have returned." He kept his word. 2 years, 7 months, and 9 days after leaving Corregidor on a torpedo boat in the dark, Douglas MacArthur is back on Philippine soil. In the months that follow, American and Filipino forces push north through the islands. Manila is liberated in March of 1945, though the fighting leaves much of the city in ruins. MacArthur walks through the wreckage of the city he once called home. He sees what the occupation has done to it, and he begins to think about what comes next. Not the war. The war is nearly over. What comes next is something else. Accountability. Japan signs the Instruments of Surrender on September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri, Tokyo Bay. MacArthur presides over the ceremony. Within days, he begins the process of identifying Japanese commanders to be tried for war crimes. Masaharu Homa is arrested and brought to Manila. The trial opens on January 3, 1946. The location: the former residence of the American High Commissioner in Manila. The building still has bullet holes in its walls from the battle to retake the city. 5 judges sit at the front of the courtroom. All 5 are American generals. All 5 were personally appointed by Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur also appointed the prosecution team. MacArthur also appointed the defense lawyers. And under the terms of the military commission, if a death sentence were handed down, Douglas MacArthur would be the one to decide whether it was carried out. The man who ordered the trial, the man who chose the judges, the man who would decide the outcome, was the same man that Hama had defeated on Bataan. Hama's chief defense counsel, an American officer named John Skeen, filed a motion to have MacArthur removed from the proceedings on exactly those grounds. The motion was denied. The trial proceeded. 48 counts of war crimes, 5 weeks of testimony. Witness after witness described what happened on the road from Marivilles to Camp O'Donnell. Hama sat in the defendant's chair and listened. At the end of the trial, he said, "I am morally responsible for whatever happened under my command." He didn't deny it. On February 11, 1946, Hama is found guilty on all 48 counts, sentenced to death by firing squad. A firing squad, not the gallows. The gallows was considered the more dishonorable death for a military man. MacArthur had made that choice himself. Hama's wife traveled to MacArthur's headquarters to beg for her husband's life. MacArthur refused to see her. He reviewed the sentence and wrote, "If this defendant does not deserve his judicial fate, none in jurisdictional history ever did." Associate Justice Frank Murphy of the United States Supreme Court wrote a dissent. He said, "Either we conduct such a trial as this in the noble spirit and atmosphere of our Constitution, or we abandon all pretense to justice." History has recorded both statements. You can decide for yourself what they mean. There is one thing worth saying here. Not to defend Hama, not to minimize what happened on the road from Bataan, but simply to note that in the entire history of American military justice, it is difficult to find another case where the man who ordered the trial, appointed the judges, and held final authority over the sentence was the same man the defendant had once defeated in the field. That is a fact. What you make of it is your own. April 2nd, 1946, the night before his execution. Hama is in his cell. He has been here for weeks, waiting. Tonight, an American chaplain sits with him. A few American guards are in the room. Someone has brought beer and sandwiches. Hama is calm. At one point, he raises his glass toward the American soldiers in the room. He smiles and says, "Please congratulate me on the start of a new life." The Americans in the room are quiet. Then Hama sets his glass down, and he says one more thing. He says, "I am being executed for the Bataan incident. What I want to know is, who was responsible for the deaths of 150,000 civilians at Hiroshima? MacArthur or Truman?" Nobody in the room answers. 4 o'clock in the morning, April 3rd, 1946, Los Baños, Masaharu. Hama walks out into the floodlights. He is 58 years old. He is tied to a post. He does not speak again. The order is given. March 11th, 1942. Douglas MacArthur left the Philippines on a torpedo boat in the dark and said, "I shall return." April 3rd, 1946, 4 years and 23 days later. The man who drove him out is dead. MacArthur kept every part of that promise. Hama was shot. MacArthur went on to command the occupation of Japan and later the Korean War. The Philippines began to rebuild, and the history books moved on. But there are people that history doesn't have room for. The men from the 200th Coast Artillery out of New Mexico, the first American unit to fire on Japanese aircraft after Pearl Harbor, who ended up on that road from Bataan. 1,816 men went to the Philippines from New Mexico. 987 came home. The ones who came home sat down at kitchen tables across that state. And sometimes, not always, not often, they said something. About a man in the column who didn't make it to morning. About a particular stretch of road. About the sound of something they heard on day 3 that they never described exactly. And then they stopped talking and went back to their food. Those stories are not in the history books. They are not in any museum. They live only in the memory of the families who were in that kitchen. If your father served in the Pacific, if your grandfather was somewhere in those islands, if someone you loved came home from that war and sat at your dinner table and said something just once that you have carried with you ever since, leave it in the comments. His name, his unit, one sentence. That's all. Don't let those stories disappear with the generation that lived them. And one more thing. Hama was not the only Japanese General MacArthur put on trial after the war. There was another one. A man who commanded Japanese forces in the Philippines when MacArthur came back. A man who had a very different reputation and a very different ending. That story is next. December 7th, 1941. 2,403 Americans were dead before the morning was over. The man who gave the order, the pilot who flew above Pearl Harbor that morning and watched it burn, his name was Mitsuo Fuchida. You'd expect the rest of his story to follow a familiar path. A war crimes trial, a prison cell, a name that disappears from the history books. It didn't. 14 years after Pearl Harbor, Mitsuo Fuchida was standing on American soil. Not in chains. He was standing at a pulpit, in churches across the Midwest, in town halls in the South, on street corners in cities where the men who survived that Sunday morning in Hawaii were still alive to look him in the eye. And he kept saying the same thing, over and over, until the day he died in 1976. I would give anything to take back what I did on the 7th of December, 1941, but that is impossible. What I can do, what I have left, is spend whatever time remains telling you about the Americans who changed me. Not soldiers, not generals, 3 ordinary people you have never heard of. How does the man who attacked America end up spending 26 years asking her for forgiveness? That question has an answer. But the answer isn't really about him. It's about what this country is made of. And the story starts long before Pearl Harbor, in a village in Japan, with a little boy sitting at his grandfather's knee. Mitsuo Fuchida was born on December 3rd, 1902, in Nara Prefecture, Japan. 4 days before he flew over Pearl Harbor, he turned 39. His grandfather was a samurai. Not a figure from a storybook. A real one. A man who had carried a sword in actual service, who had lived by a code, who had watched Japan begin to modernize and had fought against it with everything he had. The Meiji government won. His grandfather went to prison for it. And the stories that old man told the boy Fuchida around the fire in the evenings, those stories planted something that would grow quietly for decades. The West had taken something from his family, from his country. That wasn't politics to him. It was personal. He entered the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy at Etajima in 1921. He was 18 years old. It was there he met a classmate named Minoru Genda. The 2 young men shared a love of flying that neither of them could quite explain, and a friendship that would eventually put both of them in the history books. Genda would plan the attack on Pearl Harbor. Fuchida would lead it. But neither of them knew that yet. By the time he graduated in 1924, Fuchida had discovered he had a rare instinct for the air. He specialized in horizontal bombing, a technique that required steady hands, precise calculation, and an ability to hold course while the ground below was on fire. He got good enough that they made him an instructor. In that same year, 1924, his training ship, the Yakumo, made a port call at San Francisco Bay. Word had just come through about the Immigration Act of 1924. The United States Congress had passed a law barring Asian immigrants from ever becoming citizens, not restricting, not limiting, barring. Fuchida was 21 years old, standing on the deck of a Japanese warship looking at the California coastline. He didn't need anyone to explain what it meant. Historian Donald Goldstein, who spent years interviewing Fuchida before his death in 1976, wrote that the young officer arrived at San Francisco with a vague discomfort about the West and left with something harder, something that didn't go away. He spent the next 17 years becoming the most experienced carrier pilot in the Imperial Japanese Navy. By August of 1941, he had logged over 3,000 hours in the air. He commanded all the air groups of the Navy's 1st Carrier Division, 6 carriers, 423 aircraft. He was chosen for the mission not because of politics, not because of connections, but because there was simply no one else who had the flight hours and the temperament to hold that many planes together over that much open ocean and bring them in on target. The morning of December 7th, 1941. 3 a.m. Hawaiian time. Fuchida wrote later that he could not sleep. He had been awake since before the alarm. He noted in his memoir that he felt, and this is his word, excited. Not afraid, not conflicted, excited. He dressed, made his final checks, and went to warm up his aircraft. 6 carriers, 230 miles north of Oahu. The sea was rough, the sky was dark. At 7:40 in the morning, he crossed the northern coast of Oahu. Below him, the island was still asleep. He slid back the canopy of his plane. The Pacific air came in sharp and cold. He raised the flare gun and fired. The signal to attack. 13 minutes later, at 7:53, he gave the order to his radio operator to transmit 3 words back to the fleet. Tora, Tora, Tora. Tiger, tiger, tiger. It meant complete surprise has been achieved. The atmospheric conditions that morning were unusual. That transmission, sent from a single aircraft over Pearl Harbor, traveled across the Pacific and was picked up by Admiral Yamamoto himself, sitting in Japan, waiting through the night. Fuchida circled above the harbor through both waves of the attack. He was there to observe, to direct, to report. He watched the USS Arizona take a hit to her forward magazine. He watched the explosion tear her open. She was gone in minutes. He watched Battleship Row disappear beneath smoke so thick it blotted out the morning sun. 2,403 Americans were dead before lunch. When he landed back on the carrier Akagi, a mechanic began the post-flight inspection and stopped. The control cable on Fuchida's aircraft was hanging by a single thread. The plane had taken 21 hits from anti-aircraft fire. Any one of several of them could have brought it down. Fuchida looked at that cable for a long moment. Then he went inside to write his report for Emperor Hirohito. He returned to Japan a national hero. He was granted a private audience with the emperor, a rare honor, reserved for men of exceptional distinction. He had done what he set out to do. He had no way of knowing that the question of why he was still alive, why that cable had held, would haunt him for the rest of his life. And that the answer, when it finally came, would not come from Japan. The war went on for another 4 years after Pearl Harbor. Fuchida fought in most of it. He led the raid on Darwin, Australia, in February of 1942, still the largest single attack ever carried out against the Australian mainland. He led strikes against British naval forces off Ceylon 2 months after that. But it was June of 1942 when something happened that he would spend years turning over in his mind. 6 days before the Battle of Midway, Fuchida collapsed on the deck of the Akagi. Emergency appendectomy, right there on the ship, in the ship's medical bay. The surgeon told him he would not be flying. He lay in the sick bay and listened to his pilots take off without him. What happened over the next 24 hours changed the entire course of the war in the Pacific. The United States Navy found the Japanese fleet. American dive bombers came in fast and low. In the space of a few minutes, the same few minutes it might take you to read this far, 4 Japanese carriers were burning. The pilots who survived the attack had nowhere to land. Their carriers were gone. They circled until their fuel ran out and came down in the Pacific. The Akagi was hit. Fire cut off the exit from the bridge. Fuchida was still aboard, his legs wrapped in surgical bandages, moving through smoke. He found a rope, threw it over the side, and tried to climb down. An explosion threw him onto the deck before he reached the bottom. Both ankles broken. He was pulled out of the wreckage and transferred to a destroyer. He had survived. His pilots had not. 2 years later, in the summer of 1944, Fuchida received orders transferring him to Tokyo. Shortly after he left, American forces landed on Tinian. The Japanese commander on the island, Vice Admiral Kakuta, and his entire staff chose to die rather than surrender. Fuchida was in Tokyo when the news came through. He did not write down what he thought about it. Then came August of 1945. Fuchida had been in Hiroshima for a week, attending a series of military planning sessions with Army officers. On the afternoon of August 5th, the telephone rang. Navy headquarters in Tokyo. They needed him back immediately. An intelligence briefing couldn't wait. He packed his things, boarded the overnight train, and left. The next morning, August 6, 1945, he was eating breakfast in Yamato when someone came in with a report. A single bomb. An entire city. The word they kept using was new. A new kind of weapon, a new kind of destruction, something that didn't have a name yet. The following day, Fuchida returned to Hiroshima with a Navy assessment team. He walked through what was left of the city. Concrete foundations with nothing on top of them. Shadows burned into walls where people had been standing when the light hit. A silence that had a different quality than ordinary silence. Not the absence of sound, but the absence of everything that makes sound. He was there for days. In the months and years that followed, the other men on that assessment team got sick and died, one after another. Fuchida had no symptoms. He wrote about all of it later. Pearl Harbor, Midway, the cable hanging by a single thread, the phone call on August 5th. In his own memoir, published in 1953, he described leaving Hiroshima the day before the bomb in these exact words. I was in Hiroshima the day before the atomic bomb was dropped, attending a week-long military conference with the Army. Fortunately, I received a long-distance call from my Navy headquarters, asking me to return to Tokyo. Fortunately, that was the word he chose. November 1945. Japan surrendered. The Imperial Navy was dissolved. Fuchida went home to his village near Osaka and started farming. He was 42 years old. He had no rank, no salary, no mission. Everything he had given his life to had been taken apart and buried. The war crimes trials opened in Tokyo the following year. He attended some of the sessions, and what he felt watching those proceedings was not remorse. It was anger. This was the justice of the victors, he believed. The Americans had done things to Japanese prisoners that were no different from what Japan had done. He was certain of it. He decided to prove it. In the spring of 1947, he went down to Uraga Harbor to meet the ships bringing Japanese prisoners of war home from American custody. He brought a notebook. He was going to fill it with testimony, evidence that the Americans were no better than anyone else. He stood on the dock and watched the men come off the ships, thin faces, worn clothes, the particular stillness of men who have been inside a long time and aren't used to open sky yet. He opened his notebook. He did not know that what he was about to hear would break something open in him that 4 years of war had never touched. Among the men walking off those ships at Uraga Harbor, Fuchida saw a face he recognized. Kazuo Kanegasaki, his flight engineer from the Akagi, a man every person in his unit had believed was dead at Midway. Fuchida pushed through the crowd. You're alive. Kanegasaki nodded. The Americans captured me. Fuchida opened his notebook to a fresh page. Kanegasaki looked at the notebook. Then he started talking. And what he said was nothing like what Fuchida had come to hear. They treated us well, Kanagasaki said. No beatings, no starvation. Fuchida waited. There had to be more to it than that. There was a girl, Kanagasaki continued. American, 18 years old. She came to the camp as a volunteer after the war ended. She brought food. She sat with the men who were sick. She read to them. He paused. After about 3 weeks, one of the prisoners finally asked her, "Why are you doing this? Why are you spending your time taking care of us?" Fuchida kept his pen still. She said, "Because Japanese soldiers killed my parents." Fuchida closed the notebook. Her name, he would later learn, was Margaret Covell. Everyone called her Peggy. Her father was James Covell. Her mother was Charma. Both of them had been Baptist missionaries, Americans who had gone to Japan in 1920 to teach at a school in Yokohama, and had stayed for nearly 2 decades because they believed it was where they were supposed to be. When the war made Japan impossible, they moved their work to the Philippines. Their children, including Peggy, the oldest, were sent back to the United States. For 2 years, the Covells lived in the mountain interior of Luzon. In a jungle valley the missionary group had named Hopevale. They held church services in a ravine they called the Cathedral in the Glen. At times, nearly 100 people came to worship there. On December 19, 1943, Japanese soldiers found them. In the Covells' belongings, the soldiers found a small portable radio. The charge, espionage. The following morning, the missionaries asked for time to pray together and read their Bibles. The request was granted. Then, one by one, they were led up the hill. 2 years after the war ended, a Japanese soldier went to the Associated Press and gave a first-person account of what had happened on that hill. He said that Charma Covell, hands tied behind her back, was the first to die. She was praying out loud when the blade came down. Peggy was a senior at Keuka College in New York when the War Department notified her family. She did not take it quietly. What she felt in the months that followed was not grief first. It was rage. But somewhere in the middle of that rage, she started thinking about her parents, specifically about what they would have been doing in the minutes before they were killed. She knew them. She knew that they would have been praying, and she knew, with the certainty of someone who had grown up watching those 2 people every day, that they would not have been praying for rescue. They would have been praying for the men who were about to execute them. That knowledge did something to Peggy's anger. It did not erase it, but it cracked it open. When the war ended, she made a decision that no one in her life could fully explain at the time. She learned Japanese. Then she went to the prison camp where Japanese soldiers were being held in American custody, and she volunteered. She brought food. She sat with the sick men. She read to them. She learned their names. For 3 weeks, she did this without anyone asking her a single question about it. Until one man finally did. "Why are you doing this?" And she told him. Fuchida walked home from Uraga Harbor and sat with what Kanagasaki had told him. In the warrior code he had been raised in, the word for revenge was katakyuchi, and it was not optional. It was an obligation. If your parents were killed, your soul was not permitted to rest until justice had been taken, not just in your lifetime, but carried forward, through your children and their children, until the account was settled. A daughter whose parents had been murdered by Japanese soldiers had one correct path in front of her. Hatred, distance, eventually, if she was strong enough, revenge. What Peggy Covell had done did not fit into any category Fuchida had a name for. He turned it over. He could not put it down. There had to be a source for something like that. A person does not simply decide to love the people who killed their parents. That doesn't come from willpower. It doesn't come from discipline. Where had she gotten it? He didn't have an answer. Not yet. Before I go on, if this story is landing the way it lands on me every time I come back to it, take a second and hit the like button. Not for the numbers. Because a story this buried deserves to be heard by more people. And it will be, if you help put it there. On December 7th, 1941, the same morning Fuchida was circling above Pearl Harbor, a farm boy from Oregon named Jacob DeShazer was in a kitchen somewhere, peeling potatoes, when the radio broke the news. He put the knife down. Japan is going to pay for this. He enlisted the following week. 4 months later, in April of 1942, 16 B-25 bombers lifted off the deck of the USS Hornet in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. A B-25 is not a carrier aircraft. Nobody had ever launched one from a carrier before. Most of the men on that deck weren't sure it could be done. It was done. The planes flew west and dropped their bombs on Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka. The first time American ordnance had fallen on Japanese soil in this war. DeShazer was the bombardier on the last plane off the deck, B-25 number 16, which the crew had named Bat Out of Hell. His target was Nagoya. After the bombs went away, the plane turned for China, but the raid had launched earlier than planned, and the fuel calculations were off. Somewhere over Japanese-occupied China, the engines quit. The crew bailed out. DeShazer landed hard in a cemetery in the dark and was captured the next morning. 3 of the captured raiders were executed by firing squad. A 4th starved to death in the cell. DeShazer survived, 40 months in captivity, 34 of them in solitary confinement. No light, regular beatings, rations that were sometimes nothing but a handful of rice, no news from home, no way to know if the war was going or lost. He wrote later that in the early months, hatred was the only thing keeping him alive. He was going to survive long enough to make Japan pay. But sometime in the 2nd year, he noticed the hatred was doing something to him he hadn't counted on. It was consuming the same man it was supposed to protect. He asked the guard for a Bible. It took months before one appeared. When it finally did, the guard told him he could keep it for 3 weeks. After that, it went back. DeShazer read it the way a man reads when he knows the library is closing. Straight through, day and night. No rationing. When he reached the Gospel of Luke, chapter 23, verse 34, he stopped. Jesus on the cross, looking at the men who nailed him there, says, "Father, forgive them. They don't know what they are doing." DeShazer put the book down. He wrote afterward that for the first time in nearly 3 years, he looked at the guard standing outside his cell and saw something he hadn't seen before. Not an enemy. A person who simply didn't know what DeShazer now knew. When the war ended, DeShazer went home to Oregon. He enrolled in Seattle Pacific College on the GI Bill. He studied theology. He married a woman named Florence. Then, in December of 1948, he and Florence boarded a ship and sailed back to Japan. Not as a soldier, not as a conqueror. He wrote up his story in a short tract and printed it himself. The title was plain: I Was a Prisoner of Japan. He handed it out at train stations, at temple gates, on street corners. One morning in 1948, Fuchida stepped off a train at Shibuya Station in Tokyo. Near the exit stood the statue of Hachiko, the dog who had come to that station every evening for 9 years after his master died, waiting for someone who was never coming back. A man near the gate was handing papers to passengers as they passed. Fuchida took one without breaking stride. He folded it and put it in his coat pocket. That evening at home, he pulled it out. The title, I Was a Prisoner of Japan. He read about DeShazer, the crash over China, the cell, the 34 months alone, the 3 men who didn't come home, the Bible that had to go back after 3 weeks, the guard he stopped seeing as an enemy. He read it through to the end. Then he sat with it. Kanegasaki at the harbor, the girl who had said, "Because Japanese soldiers killed my parents." 2 people, 2 stories, the same answer to the same question. How do you stop hating when you have every reason not to? Both of them had pointed to the same place. The next morning, Fuchida went out and bought a Bible. He read it alone. No church, no pastor. Just the book, in a farmhouse near Osaka, while the country outside rebuilt itself from the war's rubble. He read for months. When he reached Luke 23:34, the same verse DeShazer had stopped at in his cell, the same words that Sharma Koval had almost certainly been speaking on that hill in the Philippines when she died, he understood. What exactly he felt in that moment, he never fully put into words. What he did next, the record shows clearly. In September of 1949, Mitsuo Fuchida, the man who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor, who had watched the Arizona burn, who had arrived at Uraga Harbor with a notebook and a determination to prove that Americans were no different, became a Christian. He was 46 years old. He wrote a letter to Jacob DeShazer, who was by then living in Japan as a missionary. In May of 1950, they met for the first time. The lead pilot of the Pearl Harbor attack and the bombardier who had sworn revenge while peeling potatoes in Oregon. Two men in a room in Osaka, comparing notes on how they had each ended up there. They began to travel together after that. At churches and meeting halls across Japan, they told the story. Fuchida first, then DeShazer, then both of them. What had changed them, and how. Every time Fuchida spoke, he told the story of Peggy Koval. The girl he had never met. The one whose answer to a question at a prison camp had done what 4 years of war could not. In 1952, Fuchida flew to the United States for the first time as a free man. He called himself an ambassador of peace. He stood before congregations in the Midwest and the South, churches where men had survived Pearl Harbor, where women had raised children alone after their husbands didn't come back from the Pacific. He said the same thing wherever he went. I would give anything, anything at all, to take back what I did on the morning of December 7th, 1941. But I cannot. What I can do is spend the time I have left telling you about the Americans who showed me something no weapon in this world could. Nobody turned him away. In 1959, he met Colonel Paul Tibbets, the pilot of the Enola Gay, the plane that had dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, the city Fuchida had walked out of on the evening of August 5, 1945, 14 hours before it ceased to exist. Fuchida told Tibbets, "You made the right decision. Without it, the war would not have ended." He spent the rest of his life moving between Japan and the United States, speaking, writing, telling the story. His children settled in America. On May 30th, 1976, he died near Osaka. He was 73 years old. He had spent 26 of his final 30 years doing the only thing he could think of that came close to being enough. The history books record Pearl Harbor in numbers. 2,403 dead, 19 ships, a date that will live in infamy. They don't record the name Peggy Koval. They don't mention that Jacob DeShazer and his wife Florence spent 30 years in Japan and built 23 churches, then came home to Salem, Oregon, where Jake lived to 95. And they say nothing about the fact that two ordinary Americans, a farm boy from Oregon and a college girl from New York, did something that no army, no navy, and no bomb had managed to do. They reached the man on the other side. Not with force, not with arguments. With something that had no rank, no uniform, and no line in any military budget. People talk about what won the Second World War. The factories, the steel, the sheer weight of American production. All of it true. But this story is pointing at something else. The kind of strength Peggy Koval carried into that prison camp with empty hands. The kind DeShazer found in a borrowed Bible in a cell with no light. And that kind, in all the years of all the wars ever fought on this earth, no enemy has ever figured out how to bomb. On December 7, 1941, Mitsuo Fuchida flew above Pearl Harbor and believed he was changing history. He was right. He just didn't know which part. His attack killed 2,403 Americans before breakfast. And it set in motion 26 years of him standing on American soil, telling anyone who would listen about the country that had changed him, not at gunpoint, not in a courtroom, but through a girl who had every reason to choose hatred, and didn't. Not a fleet, not a bomb. An 18-year-old standing in front of her parents' killers, deciding what kind of person she was going to be. And a cheap paper tract pressed into a stranger's hand at a train station in Tokyo. Before you go, I want to ask you something. If your father served in the Pacific, if your grandfather was at Pearl Harbor, or Guadalcanal, or Iwo Jima, or any of the islands whose names you grew up hearing at the dinner table, chances are he didn't talk about it much. That generation didn't. But maybe there was a night, just one, when something slipped out. A name he mentioned once, and never again. Something he saw that he carried home without ever putting it fully into words. Half a sentence. A pause that went on too long. A look that crossed his face when a certain song came on. Those stories are leaving us. The men who lived them are gone, or almost gone. But what they carried home, what they couldn't bring themselves to say out loud, that still lives in you. Tell me in the comments. What did he say? What did you hear at that table that you've never read in any history book? Don't let those stories disappear quietly. Put them here. Someone needs to hear them.